Hello, and welcome to another episode of Off Camera on Record podcast, the podcast where we discuss the process by which we produce amazing visual content. My name is Aaron Ross. I am the founder of Aaron Ross Media Company, and one of the things we specialize in is podcast production. Over 300 podcast episodes shot and edited at this point. So we know the ins and outs of podcasts, podcast production, how to light them, how to film them, how to record them, get everything just right. So in this series that we've been doing the last few episodes, we're going through the basics of podcasting one step at a time. In the last episode, we talked about podcast audio, the do's and don'ts, the different type of microphones. We're going to give you a similar run through with a quick crash course on podcast visuals. All right. So I sat down and I made some notes for you guys. And today we'll be discussing podcast video basics. Right. All right. So get your notebooks out, get ready to learn some stuff. All right. First and foremost, we need to talk about why video matters in podcasting. It's 2025 going on 2026. I don't understand if you don't have any visuals, how you're even getting people to know you exist. What are you posting on social media? What are you sharing with people to tell them that you have a podcast, right? Like a picture of a thumbnail? Like that's not going to cut it, especially if you're not already famous and you don't already have like a bajillion friends, right? We need to cut through the noise when we're producing podcasts. And this is specifically talking to people who are starting new podcasts. And even if you've done something successful in the past, every new venture has a curve, it has a ramp, and it needs to ramp up properly, right? And it needs to overcome the fact that like no one's discovered it yet, right? And so video is absolutely critical if you want actual discovery, if you want the chance to be seen and then heard. We live in a world where you're seen and then heard, right? And the great thing about podcast content is that you can clip it up for social, use those clips as promo, throw subtitles and captions on there, and people don't even need to listen to it to start absorbing your content on their social feeds. And it'll eventually, if it resonates with them, it'll eventually break through into actual fans and dedicated listeners and followers and all that good stuff, right? So on the technical side, YouTube is now the #1 podcast delivery platform. That's over Spotify, Apple Podcast, any of these other RSS feed driven audio only podcast delivery systems. It's YouTube. YouTube is the #1 for getting new people in the room, right? And it makes a lot of sense. Billions at this point of people are already on YouTube. Right? They're already watching their favorite content, and podcast content is now become a visual, it's a visual medium in a way where maybe 5-10 years ago, it wasn't necessarily that. Now people associate podcasting with visuals 100% of the time. The average casual, just audience member for any type of content, right? If you ask them like, what a podcast looks like, they have a vision in their mind. They know exactly what a podcast looks like. And that goes to show how critical visuals are to podcasting in general, right? And another thing I want to talk about in this particular section is how one of the things that you get out of the video side of your podcast is you get to convey the personality, right? The facial expressions, how you dress, you know, the way you animate your hands when you talk, right? All of these things are very important to building an audience and creating connection. And, you know, increasing visibility would technically require being visible, right? Am I right? Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I right? Leave a comment if I'm right or if I'm wrong. Let's talk about it, right? All right, so let's get into the technical nitty-gritty of this whole podcast universe world, right? The first thing I want to talk about when it comes to the visual side of podcast video basics, right, is framing and composition for single-person podcasts and multi-person podcasts, right? And so, you know, you can get into some of the more like technical things about filming in general, right? There's this thing that we call like the rule of thirds, right? So you imagine you see this frame that I'm in, right? And if I put my hands like right here, like that kind of cuts it into thirds, right? And within the rule of thirds, like, you know, we don't need to get into the weeds, into the science of the rule of thirds, but it's designed to create a visually appealing image, right? And there's also thirds going horizontally, right? And that's kind of like if you've ever used a camera that had like a grid overlaid onto the image to help you kind of like frame it right. The grid is generally speaking framed in two sets of thirds, right? And the reason why is because if you follow the rules of thirds, right, and you put certain things in certain boxes, right, you get an automatically aesthetically pleasing image. And where this is particularly relevant in podcasting in general is that, like, if it's a single person podcast like what I'm doing right now, right, you generally want to be in the center of the frame, right, like this, and you want your eye line somewhere near that top third line, right? If you imagine this divided into lines, you want your eyes right here, right? I also like to maintain like a certain amount of headroom, right? And so when we're talking video production, headroom is just the space between the top of your subject's head and the top of the frame, right? And the reason why you want headroom when you're doing podcast content is because, especially when you're clipping it up for social, right? It looks really nice when I clip this vertical to have that little bit of space, right? So that I'm not all the way at the top of the screen where there might be usernames or handles, or there might be just junk up there that would actually be over the top of my head. It might look weird. And the other thing too is, and we'll get into this later, right? But depending on what resolution you're shooting in, whether it's 4K or 1080, you might want to like zoom in for dramatic effect and do different things with your video content that are a lot easier to do when you have a little space, right? So, you know, keep the eyes kind of top of the frame, single person, you want to keep them center, and you want definitely headroom, whether it's multi-person or single person, right? Now, getting into the multi-person sets for how you'd want to frame it, I personally like to frame my individual close-up shots of each person who's participating, right? Off to 1/3 of the frame, depending on if they're looking to the left or if they're looking to the right, if that makes any sense to you. So where if it's single camera, I want them dead center. If it's multi-camera and you're spending most of the shot kind of like over here or most of the shot kind of over here talking, you see how I'm naturally moving over to this third of the frame. And I'm imagining having like a dialogue with an invisible person like over here and how that looks more natural to give this space in this area, right? And have the implied other person like over there and reversing it on the other side if they're facing this way. It's just more aesthetically pleasing image and it looks much more professional. Just take my word for it, all right? You definitely want some separation between you and the background because the more separation you have between you and the background, it really doesn't matter what kind of camera you have. You'll start getting that blurred background, which separates the subject and kind of makes you pop on the screen and look nice and sharp with the blurry background. Again, just a quick way to make it very professional. If the wall is too close behind you, it could have that security camera look where everything's in focus. And that can be a look, especially if there's things on the wall that you want people to be able to read. If you have like posters or plaques or signs or trophies or whatever. But kind of like for that classic pro podcast look, you want that blurred background. You want that separation. And the easiest way to create it is physically separate yourself from the wall. Done. Right? All right. So we understand more or less how to frame this. And I can do like a deeper dive in a future video if you guys want. Leave a comment to let me know, or leave a like or share, or just like hype this up. If you want me to do like an actual crash course on set, on location, with the cameras out and a subject where I can go through each one of these steps one by one. But I think in this series, you know, we're sitting at the desk. This is our in-house podcast. And I just want to make sure you guys know what's going on and have heard these concepts, kind of got a basic understanding. And then you can research in detail the things that you want more detail on, right? Okay, So let's get into the next chapter in this movie, right? Which is lighting, the basics of lighting for podcasts, right? Now, I actually have a diagram here for you guys that I'll bring up in a second, right? But kind of the rules of thumb for lighting in general apply for podcast lighting. And you want to kind of use the most basic technical lighting rules and standards if you want a classic technical professional look, right? And so there's three kind of lights, well, really four lights that you should be aware of, right? When lighting in general, right? There's what we call the key light, the fill light, and the backlight, all right? So we're gonna check out this lovely diagram right here, right? And you can see the key light is the main light. That is the brightest light that's on your subject. Usually it's about 45 degrees off to the side. You can see in this diagram right here, it's about 45 degrees off to the side, pointed directly at the subject, right? You have what's called the fill light. Now, the fill light is kind of the opposite, mirroring the key light, but it's not as bright as the key light. And that's something that I need you guys to understand for that classic pro look. If you look at my face on camera, I clearly have a key light that like is over here somewhere, right? And I have fill light that's coming in from kind of like the ambient light in the room. And I also have a lamp on this far side that's serving as like a fill to fill in some of these shadows. So it's not like super dark, Streets of Gotham type of look here, right? And that's the point of the fill light, is to make the shadows less drastic without removing the shadows, right? Because you want a little bit of the shadow. You want to show some depth. You want to show some contrast there, right? A backlight is if I was to put a light behind me, pointed at me. And what that would do is that would create like separation between me and the background. You would see like kind of like a glowing edge to my hairline. Sometimes people refer to it as a hair light for that particular reason. And you'll notice on like really high-end sets or things that are very giving that high-end production look, they tend to throw a backlight on the subject. It makes it look very TV, if you know what I mean. And the fourth type of light that is not in this diagram is actually what we would call like an accent light, right? And an accent light is when you throw like a splash of colored light on the background. If you look behind me here, this, I guess, light that I installed in the back of the shelf is serving as an accent light, right? It's giving a little splash of purple color on the, where the brick wall meets the acoustic panel. And it gives some texture. I like purple. I like, these kind of neon purple lights and stuff like that. So I have some on my desk and I keep some back there. And that's kind of how you add a little bit of style and a little bit of flair, right? And you always want to make sure that you're using plenty of light, that it's well lit, right? Because in my opinion, lighting is about 70% of like what makes the podcast look good, right? If you have a ton of light and you're properly exposed on your camera, and we'll get into cameras in a second, but like once you should, whatever camera you decide to get, read the manual, watch the tutorials, learn your camera. I'm not going to sit here and go through the specs of every single camera model that's on the open market, because there are new cameras coming out every day. There are new brands coming out every day. The basics are always the same, right? And just learning your camera, how it works, and the fundamentals of it, I think is going to be super critical. So, that's something you should do. And speaking of cameras, let's get right into what type of camera you should be using for your video podcast, right? And I have it broke down here into several categories, right? 4 categories to be specific. These are kind of the 4 main categories of the type of cameras that you would most typically find on a podcast set, right? And the number one, most first and foremost camera that I think we should start with is the phone. That's right, the phone. If you have a well-lit environment, most phones, relatively new phones, are surprisingly good video quality. So, if you're just starting out, you don't want to spend the money on a camera. You want to kind of get your ideas out there, right? You watched our last video. You went ahead and you got yourself like a USB microphone, or you got yourself some kind of clip-on microphone situation, or whatever you got, right? Something that plugs into your phone, whatever you got, right? You got something off of Amazon for $30, who cares, right? You want to get the ball rolling. You want to get started, right? The phone is an excellent, great way to start this process, especially if you're doing single camera podcasts. But even if you're doing like multi-person set, right? Let's say it's you and another person, kind of like one-on-one style, or it's you and two other people, group style, whatever. I would still, you could put your phone in this landscape mode, AKA sideways, as opposed to vertical. And I think for podcasts, you should shoot it horizontal, like the way a regular camera shoots, because like I said, YouTube is the #1 discovery platform. So like, you want to make your social media content vertical, but your long form content horizontal, so that people can watch it on their TVs and people can watch it on their phones in a way that blends in with the rest of the podcast content that they're consuming on a daily basis, which is all going to be horizontally shot on YouTube. All right, so phones, great place to start, right? But phones can get tricky, managing all that storage and figuring out where to put all these large files on my phone that's not really conveniently transferable, or do I have to buy a thing, or da-da-da-da-da, right? So it might be a good idea to go ahead at some point and get a dedicated camera. With a camera, you can get SD cards that you can just simply slot into your USB on your computer or your laptop or whatever, dump the footage onto your hard drive, and keep it pushing. And it's a much easier way for long-term podcast production to store and organize all that crazy footage. And so the next step of breaking down cameras is to talk about one of my favorite options for shooting podcast content, which is mirrorless cameras, right? And mirrorless cameras are the cameras you've seen all the time, every day. Here, I'll give you some examples of mirrorless cameras here, right? They're classic DSLR cameras, with a detachable lens. Oftentimes, these are considered really good cameras. You can see in the price that they get expensive. You don't have to get the most expensive ones. There's a lot of holiday savings right now, but you can see this EOS R50 is only $570. And yes, it is an investment, right? A mirrorless camera is an investment, but this is the quickest way to get professional look, in my opinion. Because with mirrorless cameras, you have lens flexibility. You can get different lenses, which means that you can be zoomed in at different focal lengths, whether you want to be all the way wide or whether you want to be close. That's something you can build a lens collection over time. Also, mirrorless cameras are great because you can shoot a ton of other content with it. You can take them outside, shoot promo content. Most of these cameras, pretty much all these cameras also take photos, amazing, beautiful photos, right? So it's kind of like a one-stop shop for all your production needs. And if this is a serious thing for you, even if it's just a hobby, if it's a serious hobby, spending $1,500, $2,000, maybe even $3,000 on a mirrorless lens, a mirrorless camera with a lens kit, I think it's actually worth it in the long run. Especially if you're serious about production, get a real camera, right? Stop waiting around, all right? Get a real camera. Do the real thing, all right? But it doesn't always have to be mirrorless cameras, because the next category of camera I want to show you guys is ones that everyone's seen. We've all experienced them, especially when we were little kids. It is the camcorder, the lovely and very familiar camcorder. And camcorders are great. Camcorders are great because the lens is built in. You don't got to buy lenses. They all zoom pretty crazy. So, you can just, toggle a button, toggle a switch, and get the framing exactly the way you want it to, zoomed in, zoomed out, whatever you need. A lot of camcorders are at very affordable prices, right? I mean, we got a 4K camcorder right here for $159, right? Is it going to be the same quality of footage that you're going to get out of a mirrorless camera? No, not unless you get a very expensive camcorder. And part of that is because camcorders are very compact, which means the sensor is very, very, very tiny. And when you're dealing with tiny sensors, you need a ton of light in order to match the image quality that you would get out of these much larger frame, much larger sensors in these mirrorless cameras. But if you want a cheap option, especially if you're doing a multi-camera setup and you're not trying to buy, 3 or 4 of these $2,000 cameras, check out all the different camcorder options and look for something that shoots in 4K. I know a lot of them shoot in 4K now. So look for something that shoots in 4K. I recommend it. If you're going to go the camcorder route, just stubbornly hold out for 4K. And try to get ones with good ratings, but stubbornly hold out for 4K. I'm telling you, you're going to be very much complaining about it if you get one that is not 4K because the image quality is already degraded compared to a mirrorless camera. And so, the 4K will give you just a little bit of boost so that it's going to be less noticeable. So I would definitely go all out and splurge for 4K. And then the last camera category I want to introduce you guys to is PTZ cameras, right? PTZ cameras. These are remote controlled cameras. They are great for multi-angles and tight spaces. And if you want a no stress camera situation, this is it. Essentially the same kind of mechanisms as a security camera, except if you notice, they all have these kind of tilt and pan camera heads, which allows you to turn the camera usually with a remote control. Some of them are app controlled, and you can basically point the camera at whatever you want to point it to from your app or your remote control and zoom in however far the camera will let you zoom in from your app or remote control. It is a great and easy way to kind of stash cameras in tight spaces. And especially if you have a small office and you want to be able to do, multi-camera podcast setup. And let's say you want to go more cameras, right? You want to go 4 cameras, 5 cameras, 6 cameras. You want a camera for every single individual person and a wide angle shot of the whole team, right? And you want to do larger groups, 4, 5, 6 people, right? Having 5 tripods with cameras on them is going to take up a ton of space in a room that might not have that space. But being able to mount PTZ cameras like security cameras, they can even be mounted upside down to the ceiling. They can be placed on a ledge or whatever on the edge of the room, windowsills even if you're really, tight for space. It is a really flexible and easy and convenient way to set up multi-cam in tight spaces and kind of have a set it and forget it type of vibe where you just set it up one time and it's done, right? And I recommend PTZ cameras when the number of cameras is out of control, because having that many tripods and potentially that many camera operators is just too much square footage for the average room. And if you are already, in a position where you can afford a very large studio space to produce your podcast, then this wouldn't necessarily apply to you. You're already miles down the road. But if you're starting up and you have some kind of a budget, especially if you're doing this podcast for your company, for your business, you're an entrepreneur, you're an employee in the marketing department that's trying to come up with some fresh new ideas for how do we get brand recognition and how do we promote our services and products, and you just have a room in the office building where there's enough space to do this, but we have to be, tight with the space, PTZ cameras. I highly recommend them. There's a bunch now that shoot in 4K. They can connect with Ethernet cables, so you can run the connection as far as you want. It's a very convenient and fun option. But this is if you have the studio on lockdown and it's stationary and it's not going anywhere anytime soon, right? If you're the type of podcaster that I'm going to shoot one episode over here, I'm going to shoot one episode over there, I'm going to be mobile with my set, or like I'm not committed to any particular location, then yeah, stick to camcorders or mirrorless cameras or your iPhone or your Samsung or whatever, your phone. But if you have a dedicated space and you want to set it up to produce and you don't want to move anything around in that space anytime soon, PTZ cameras are a great option, and I highly recommend and I highly suggest them. All right, so the next kind of thing that I want to get into real quick is let's break down some of the technical aspects of the video production side, especially as it relates to podcasting, that I think you're going to want to know. And it starts with resolution and frame rate, right? So frame rate is how many pictures per second create your image, right? So standard would be like 24 frames per second. You have 30 frames per second. And then when you get higher, those are usually used for kind of action type shots where things are moving fast and you don't want it to be too blurry, or if you're gonna use it to create slow motion footage, right? And if you have the slow motion option on your iPhone, then you know that when you set it to slow motion, it shoots your frame rate up to like 120 frames per second, or sometimes 240 frames per second. And that's literally so you can slow it down crazier amounts. The higher the frame rate, the slower you can make it. So obviously, super high frame rates are not relevant to podcasting. You're looking at either 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. Now, it's debatable and subjective whether you want to go 24 or 30. Most professional productions will actually go 30 frames a second, because it's a little bit more smooth and natural for talking content, especially when you're switching from a bunch of different camera angles. Whereas 24 frames a second has a more cinematic look to it, right? A little bit more natural blur when, motion blur when people move around and stuff like that. And so, it's subjective. I think if you want to just have the easy by the book, guideline, 30 frames per second, right? As far as resolution goes, really your options are 1080p HD or 4K. And I think you know where I'm going to stand on this. If you have the space for it on your hard drives, if you have the patience for it, because they take longer to upload, they take longer to download, they take longer to everything, right? I would go 4K. I would go 4K just for the flexibility of being able to zoom in. And I want to explain to you with another image. It's not exactly a diagram, although you can call it a diagram. Right here, right? Here's the difference between 480, 720, 1080, and 4K, right? And you can see that 1080 frame is relatively small inside that 4K frame. So the reason why I'm showing you this is so that you understand that you can zoom in to that 4K image quite a bit, right? Especially if you're exporting it as a 1080 image, and maintain the sharpness and the fidelity of the image for your 1080 exports if, 1080 is like a streamline. But you can pretty much like zoom in 200% on any 4K clip that's well lit, and not have any issues with like a 1080 render and upload to YouTube type situation. So that's why I recommend 4K. However, right? If you're doing a multi-camera shoot, right? Especially if you have like cameras that just have great image quality in general, like if you're using like a Sony mirrorless camera or something like that. If you're doing 4 cameras, 3 cameras, 4 cameras, just be wary that, shooting an hour plus of content on 3 or 4 different cameras simultaneously is going to be a ton of space and footage. And you're going to be looking at somewhere in the range of like 150 to 300 gigs of raw footage per episode, right? So that's just something to consider, right? If you want to go 4K multicam, you are going to need a ton of hard drive space. And I mean a ton, especially if you're doing a show a week for 45 to 50 weeks out of the year. You can just do the math. You're going to need terabytes and terabytes and terabytes every year. And in a professional environment, that's understood, that's kind of the name of the game, right? But for people who are just starting, that could be a learning curve that, you might learn the hard way when you run out of space and you're just like, what's going on? Why am I running out of space so fast, right? So that's something that I would definitely consider when it comes to the 4K versus the 1080. But like I said, if you can, especially if you're doing single camera, just go for the 4K, right? Go for the 4K if it's something that is doable for how you record. If you are recording on OBS, for example, you're probably going to be in 1080, and that's totally cool. I mean, it's optimized for streaming and being able to pull things up online in real time. So I'm actually using OBS to produce the visuals for this series. I have my Panasonic Lumix camera here mounted to the desk, which does shoot in 4K, but I'm running it through a ATEM Mini Pro switcher, which maxes out at 1080. So to avoid any weirdness or complications, I've matched the 1080 to the 1080, and it's coming out of OBS in 1080. And for the single cam and what I'm using it for, I think that this is more than enough to get the point across, right? And at the end of the day, that's the main thing. You want to get your point across. You want to get your content out there. It's more important that you have your content coming out and being consistent than it is that you be a perfectionist about every little thing, right? All right, so last little sets of things I want to go over before we wrap this up. Every camera has like a different set of picture profiles, right? There's standard picture profiles, which you'll see when you read the instruction manual of your camera. They're kind of like cooked in colors right out the box. They're designed to look good immediately, so you don't really have to do any work to them if you don't want to. If you're just starting out and you're not really in it for like being a production nerd, but you're in it just because you want your podcast out on the internet, just use the standard color profiles. If you want to be more cinematic and you love the details and the nuances of production, there's what they call log profiles, right? And those are much flatter profiles, but they contain a lot more data and information, which allows you to do wonderful and amazing things when you manipulate the colors in post-production. But if you're not trying to do a bunch of color grading on your footage, don't worry about it. Just use the standard color profiles, right? The next thing that is very important, mismatching cameras from different angles. I know sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we kind of have this Frankenstein production set where, I have a Canon camera and a Sony camera and a Lumix camera, and that's all we have between the team, and we have to shoot with that, right? The problem is mismatched cameras, right, have different color settings, color science in their sensors. And so the colors are going to look very different. If you don't know how to match the colors, watch as many tutorials as you have the patience for color matching, especially if you're using different cameras. But if you can avoid it, just get 3 of the same camera. I'm telling you, it'll save you so much headache. It'll save you so much time. You're not going to have to learn a bunch of new things. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to save you time so you don't have to learn a bunch of new things, all right? And when you're using multiple cameras, I mean, for some people it's obvious, but I just want to state it. Make sure all your settings are matched. They should all have the same white balance. Do not use auto white balance when you're using multiple cameras. Set it to an actual number, like 5600 Kelvin or whatever, just for an example. Make sure they have the same white balance, the same shutter speed, the same frame rate, the same color profile, everything, right? If they're the same camera, the same color profile. If they're not the same camera, you can still make sure that the white balance, the shutter speed, and the frame rate are identical on all of the cameras on the shoot. Otherwise, it will be a problem. I'm telling you, it's not worth it. All right? So the very last thing is just make sure you're looking at your image before you hit record and you're confirming with yourself, if it's just you or with your team, if you got a team of people, that we're properly exposed. We don't want to be overexposed where we're losing detail. We don't want to be underexposed where it's too dark and it's a noisy, grainy, kind of gross footage. We want it to be perfectly exposed, and depending on what camera you're using, you could either go on ChatGPT, Google or YouTube to find out how to perfectly expose for that specific camera, right? But never overexpose, never underexpose. It's the Goldilocks theory. You want it to be just right. And with your white balance, yes, you can change in post-production and make it warmer or colder, depending on the look you're going for. But why add that extra step when you can just properly set your white balance before you hit record in the studio or at the desk or wherever you're at, right? So that's my final suggestion when it comes to all of this. And that's basically everything you need to know about the video side from the quick rundown. Everything else is going to get into the nitty gritty details and specifics, but that's the main thing, right? So we talked about how to frame it. We talked about how to light it, right? Key light, fill light, backlight, accent light, right? We talked about the 4 different categories of cameras for podcasting: iPhone, mirrorless camera, PTZ cameras, and camcorders, right? And then last we talked about like the technical spec details of the post-production side of it. So shooting in 4K if you can, 1080 if you can't, setting the correct white balance, making sure that the exposure is good. And when you combine all these things together, you should get a really nice looking product. And the definition of a nice looking product is that nobody notices anything about it, right? I've been doing production a long time. And one of the best things for knowing if it's good content, right, is if nobody noticed anything other than what you were talking about, right? But the second somebody notices anything about the production itself, it's usually a mistake, right? Oh, why is that light so bright? Oh, why is that like so dark? Oh, why is that blurry and out of focus? That means that you made a mistake. People do not notice good production. They just enjoy the production. But people do notice bad production, all right? So keep that in mind, and thank you so much for tuning in to the Off Camera on Record podcast, where we discuss how to make podcasts in this particular series, but, in the bigger picture, how to produce great and amazing content. Don't forget to like, comment, share this with your friends, hit the notification bell if you're already subscribed, subscribe if you're not subscribed. Let's build a community of production people. Let's build a community of podcasters. Let's just give away all the secrets of how all of this is made, right? So that everyone can have an opportunity to give it their best shot. Right? Because there's some great content out there that hasn't been made yet because somebody doesn't know how to do the camera or doesn't know how to get the sound right. And they're having these like kind of technical setbacks that honestly we shouldn't be dealing with in this day and age, right? Everyone should have the knowledge. It's all out there, and sometimes we just don't know what the terms are. We don't know how to look for it. And that's what this series is all about. So thank you guys again, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.